What if your private practice was a space for your healing and growth too? What if we could move our practices from a stress-driven business model to a practice that grows as we thrive? What if we become courageous leaders and agents of change through our practices? Join us as we explore the journeys of inspiring psychologists who are healing through private practice. So our two guests in this episode are Taslim Tharani, an organizational and coaching psychologist, and Dr. Christina Barker, holistic clinical psychologist and trauma specialist. And welcome to this episode, both of you. I'm really delighted to be able to spend this time speaking to you about this topic of overcoming career trauma and disillusionment through private practice. So this is a topic that I really wanted to get into because I've also experienced it. I think this whole series about healing through private practice is essentially kind of group therapy for me. So thank you for coming along today and kind of co-regulating and kind of sharing stories with me, because I kind of recognize myself in all different parts of this series. But this topic of career trauma and disillusionment, I've had different relationships with it through the years, I think. My first experience of feeling really traumatized through my career was when I was actually working in public sector, and I was working as a Ministry of Defence psychologist. And that was, just through kind of poor leadership, toxic working practices and so on, I really got to a point where I was burnt out. But what that did for me was really ruptured the trust that I had in myself, and also the trust that I kind of had in psychology. And there was then this period of disillusionment and reformulating of my own identity and how I wanted to continue to practice. So, that was my kind of initiation into what it feels like is then a kind of let me think. It's a kind of cycle almost. The other experience I had then was through the pandemic, where I had been spending I'd spent 20 years working with big global organizations on helping leaders to think about uncertainty and preparing them for, I thought, things that can come out of the blue and really knock you off track, and how to continue to lead through uncertainty. And we called it leading in a VUCA world, volatility, uncertainty. I can't remember what the rest of VUCA stands for now. But when the pandemic happened, it was very disillusioning to see what actually happened in terms of leadership in some of those big organizations. And again, I had to go through this process of coming to terms with that. And I think I'm still coming to terms with that on the corporate side of the work that I do. And then reformulating a different identity for myself in this direction, in a new direction, thinking about regeneration, thinking about this ecosystem of private practices that we're developing. So those are a couple of examples of where I feel like I've been through a similar process. I've not gone into the details of how traumatizing some of that was. And I know that for both of you, you've had kind of experiences in depth about some of these issues as well. And I just wondered if you would be happy to kind of share some of that with us. So I'm going to come to Christina, first of all, for some of your experiences. Hi.
Yeah, I know that throughout the coaching that I've received through yourself, I've spoken probably at length about some of these experiences. But what I recognised even yesterday in the run-up to sort of coming here today and to speak to you for this podcast was that there were some of the memories that I'd almost forgotten about. I'd almost like parcelled them off, neatly and put them to one side in sort of preparation to go back into some of the work that I previously
Yeah.
undertook. So I started unpacking, I suppose, before bed, as you do. Well, what were some of the actual key traumas, the core traumas that have caused like significant um, levels of distress and disruption to my career path, really.
Yeah.
And I suppose it took me right back to where I started when I was like really eager and keen to be a psychologist,
Yeah.
and how sort of my whole career path had been tailored around that. All I needed was to become a professional and get that onto that doctorate and be a psychologist.
Yeah.
And when I remembered right back to where that drive came in, it was sort of my following my first degree, which was actually forensic science. I went into working with young offenders, so the youth offending teams. And it was there that you needed a professional qualification, whether it was nursing, psychology, or social work, to progress your career. So I was sort of boxed in. There was no way of progressing without stepping forward in one of those directions. Um, and I suppose the frustration came when there was, I suppose we've seen maybe on the news over the years. So because we're going back about 20 years now, there was the sort of CSE scandals, so the child
Yeah.
sexual exploitation, and I was coming into contact with a number of, particularly young girls, it often looked after children who would be classed as vulnerable, but at high risk for being targeted by men in the community and exploited sexually. And they were actually criminalised through that process.
Mm.
Missing, and then they wouldn't be meeting me for their scheduled appointments because it's like a probation sort of setup, but for young people. And then having to go into court to sort of present and speak in defence of these vulnerable girls. And I probably didn't recognise at the time, but I suppose that's where the trauma started to hit home, or to sort of
Yeah.
take shape, and it also shaped my career, sort of like my personal passions and what's drove me into this career, all stemmed from, I suppose, that point of wanting to make a change, wanting to make an influence, and be more influential across services so that we could support the young people. So that's sort of the direction my career went in then, really. After training, well, there's lots of things went on prior to training. It's a lengthy career process. I suppose it took maybe 10 years to actually become qualified from starting studies. But then I went through to, working for a short time in Rotherham, then in the specialist CSE and sexual trauma children's homes, right up until the back end of just as we came out of lockdown. So that was the sort of work that kept driving me.
Yeah.
And I suppose the layers of trauma that came from that field, witnessing also in the inpatient units that the young people are often labelled, stigmatised,
Yeah.
diagnosed and medicated and seen as problematic, personality disordered or psychotic, and not addressing the trauma that's been hidden in their lives. So
Yeah.
that was sort of the the main trauma, but I realise that's the thread that's run through my career, uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
until a point of complete burnout, which I would probably describe as a breakdown as well. But then I
Yeah.
was with a system that is harmful and often unhelpful. We think about mental health, and when people do get into a crisis situation, which really mirrored and replicated the thing that was causing me distress in my professional life in terms of
Yeah.
women and girls not being understood and considered from a psychological viewpoint, recognizing the harm that's been caused to them through their trauma experiences, and I
Yeah.
was experiencing that then as
Yeah.
an
And
individual.
from what you're describing, that sounds also, I mean, apart from vicarious trauma, it
Mhm.
sounds almost like then it it's not the same as vicarious trauma. It literally became a trauma for you. Like, it wasn't just something that you observed, it was something that then kind of swept you into the same kind of vortex almost in that oppressive system. Yeah.
Yeah, I know.
Go on, sorry, Taz.
I was just going to come in because, you mentioned that there might be layers to this, but it sounds like a real combination of vicarious trauma as well as moral injury. That there was there were these injustices or this kind of mismatch in terms of your own like values and morals, and what the system was doing to these young people. So it just sounds like there's lots of layers there in terms of that build up of trauma over the years.
Yeah, the multiple layers of that as well. Because I suppose what I recognised yesterday as well, thinking about this, was there's almost like a silencing across the board, and it is a vortex, and it's a very strange type of dynamic to go into when you're working within that field of trauma, particularly sexual trauma, because there's the multiple layers of oppression and silencing throughout the system, that, like, even the local authorities, going back to the time that they started unfolding, you sign in a contract that says you're not allowed to speak about anything that occurs in the workplace. You're referring these cases and concerns, real evidence, liaising with police forces and escalating the information up through child protection procedures, not getting information back, but being told that that's how the procedure, that's how it works. You can't ask questions.
Yeah.
So really early on, being silenced and not being able to speak up. And I mean, it was early in my career and I was young, if something like that was happening now, I might be a bit more clued up to, in terms of whistleblowing and, not following orders. But at that time, going back 20 years, I think we were more like, you follow orders and you do what the organisation tells you to do. You don't question things, some of that. And again, good girl conditioning that as a female, again, starting to realise, I've not been subjected to the things that these young girls had been on the same extent and the same level, but some exposure to abusive practices or, the patriarchy or toxic masculinity, different challenging sort of relationships in my own youth, on situations. So the layering there of how it actually mirrors some of your own experiences as well, and maybe the blame that comes towards the individual, particularly I know the young girls that end up in the criminal systems and the inpatient units, they feel that they're the problem. They're given a diagnosis of personality disorder oftentimes, or psychosis, because they're reacting to the extreme experiences that they've had. But the system comes down on them and creates more trauma, re-traumatizing them, and to be witnessing that and to be part of that system. When the change that's needed is probably more systemic and societal. You feel quite helpless to make changes at that point.
Exactly.
An individual,
Thanks for sharing that. I want to bring Taslim in now because to hear about your experiences, and then not to kind of just reference one another's experiences, but I'm starting to feel like there may be kind of similarities and commonalities that may emerge. So
I mean the vicarious trauma, just because of the work that I've done and am doing, I've experienced less of in my career, or being an organizational psychologist. I think that's kind of not at that kind of extreme level where I'm working directly with people who are going through traumatic experiences themselves. But I want to start with a quote, which I think really just sums up my experience of being in psychology. And I think that I started to feel this quite significantly during my master's in occupational psychology, where I was bullied in my master's by my fellow cohort. because of the way that I pronounced things. And that's kind of, I think, when this started to emerge for me. So to be nobody but yourself in a world which is doing its best to make you like everybody else means to fight the hardest battle ever. And I would say that my experience in psychology has been that there is, you know, a lot of the research that we do is all normative, right? There's something about, you know, how do we, like, there is a certain way to be a psychologist, and if you are not being a psychologist in that way, you said those words like, you are the problem, there's something wrong with you, that it's not the discipline, it's not the profession. And as I was thinking about this, I will go back and share some of the moments maybe, but I was thinking about even my bio, and this was pointed out to me by somebody, by a mentor, who said, it's interesting in your bio, you say that you combine the human approach with the evidence base that psychology is grounded in. So I have separated out in my own belief system or understanding that there is this humanness and then there is this evidence base in psychology, which suggests that they are not one and the same thing.
Right.
Which is so fascinating to me that I've unconsciously done that. So what is it about the profession that has resulted in me feeling like the humanist soul has kind of been stripped away from it? And last year I was on a coaching qualification, which was grounded in something called psychosynthesis, which is a psychospiritual approach to it's a psychospiritual approach to therapy and coaching. And I think most psychologists who come from that evidence-based perspective would completely discredit it because it's more theoretical and philosophical than it is evidence-based. But they brought us back to the etymology of the soul. The etymology of psychology, which actually means the study of the soul. And I thought that was so fascinating because that's the bit that I feel has kind of been missing in my psychology experience, that what we do or the work that we're meant to be doing with our clients is not what we experience within the profession. Like you said, Christina, you know, we experience the silencing and actually a dehumanization of ourselves as psychologists within these broad systems. So I guess just wanted to frame what I'm going to share kind of with that. And then I really resonated, Christina, with what you shared about these systems, or these systems of oppression. And I think my career traumas, I have had some that have been quite significant and very explicit, but the majority of them have been very subtle and very implicit. And there's lots of different things about me me different. So for example, being South Asian, being female, I've now recently had an ADHD diagnosis. I've also had my own mental health challenges, and my own trauma from within my own kind of background and family life and upbringing. And all of those things together makes me quite different, as well as having the kind of cultural influences in my life. My parents were born in East Africa. They moved to East Africa when I was 10 years old. So I've got these. I'm British, but I'm not British, if that makes sense. And so when I think about career traumas, you might have these kind of big moments of career traumas, of things that might happen. You know, a toxic situation, or a bullying manager, or you know, some big thing that happens that is really significant. But most of my experiences have really been those day-to-day things that happen that you almost don't even realize. You know, they're those things that you just brush off, but over time, coming back to what you said, Wendy, they start to, for me, they started to erode away any sense of self and self-esteem that I had. What they did was really start to disconnect me from me. So I started to really experience a disconnection from self. And they also were so subtle that, like, I become the problem, that that all these things are happening, and I can tell that I'm being singled out, or I'm not being given this opportunity, or there's an article where someone writes about some work that we're doing in East Africa, and all the men are named in the article, and the women who've been supporting aren't named in the article. Those kinds of things start to happen, and I sit there thinking, is it me? Is it my personality? Is it because I'm just wrong in some way, shape, or form? Or is it actually because of gender, because of age, because of race, because of ethnicity, because of my religion? And I think in some ways, when it is more explicit, I actually think it's easier to deal with. So, for example, in one of my first ever jobs, it was associate coaching work. I was told I can't coach anyone younger than myself. I can't coach anyone older than myself. So I could only coach people my age and younger, which is ridiculous. I mean, that is blatant ageism. But because it was so obvious that that's ageist, it was like, that's ageist. I'm going to ignore it, and I'm going to coach whoever wants to work with me.
Yeah.
But when it's that kind of subtle, implicit discrimination that happens, it's really difficult to then I think that kind of inward focus of self-blame, that disconnection to self, the eroding of self-esteem, the not being able to trust ourselves, that constant second guessing starts to emerge. And I was going to talk about this later in response to another question, but just because, Christina, you've kind of started to share about these systems, and over the last 5 years or so, I've really been thinking about these systems that we navigate, and how psychology as a profession is actually there. It exists to uphold some of these systems. And Bell Hooks talks about these 4 systems of oppression. And she talks about capitalism being one of them. So that feeds the not good enough stuff a lot. That you are the problem. If you're not succeeding, it's because you're defective in some way. You mentioned, Christina, patriarchy. So patriarchy is a big part of that. And, what we don't realize is things like patriarchy affect men just as much as it affects women. So there's patriarchy. There's something called white supremacy culture, which people often really misunderstand. But I really recommend this article by Oken and Jones that talks about these cultural aspects that kind of seep into our ideology and our systems without us even being aware of it. The sense of urgency, this worship of the written word, and lots of other things. And then the 4th one that she talks about is imperialism, and they all kind of interact in different ways to kind of impact us at an individual level. And I think that now I have a lot more of a greater understanding of how these systems influence just the ideology that we exist in, and therefore influences everything that has come through in psychology. So all of our research articles and our papers and, what we're reading, what we're absorbing, but because it's unspoken, it's unsaid, and it's not made explicit, we're not even realizing it. Like, so many of the theories that we study have all been, they've largely had white male middle class participants. And so they're not representative, and the way that we do research. So I'm going to stop there because I've said a lot, but I think there's, so there's been a which comes back again to what you said, Christina, which is around this kind of not following orders and not questioning. And for me, there is that kind of seeking approval. And that kind of, I must say that kind of came from within me, that I grew up in a cultural context where you have respect for, like, hierarchy, for status, for your elders. And I grew up in that context where I am okay once somebody else approves of me. And until that point, I'm not okay. And for lots of different reasons, the professional route for occupational psychology has been incredibly challenging. We've had multiple changes since I graduated from my master's. old route, then there was a 2010 route, then there was a 2012 route, then there were lots of changes around those, and then there was a 2019 route. And the lack for me, the lack of professional approval from the BPS itself has had such a huge impact on my career. And not only that, but somebody back in when I was going through a lot of physical illness, challenged my integrity. And that happened in a public place when I was in a leadership role. And I don't think I have ever fully recovered from that, because that experience and then her, I would say, discrimination towards me over the years meant that I did not end up getting my chartership in occupational psychology. And not having that box ticked, despite the fact that I know that I am a really ethical, really good psychologist, is so unbelievably heart-wrenching. Our profession can do something like that.
Yes.
And also, it's just, for me, it's just so shocking. Like, how do we, like, we're a profession that's about alleviating harm, and yet as a profession we inflict harm on our own community. And that is very devastating. I got a bit emotional there, but yes, I'll pause, I'll stop there. I've said a lot.
It is devastating. I think especially because we come in to the profession often with, and I'm rejecting this sense that, we come in naive and idealistic, because actually we come in as, let's say, human beings who have been less subject to the oppressive system that we are going into, if you see what I mean. So are we naive and idealistic at that point? Maybe, but only from a position of a judgment point within an oppressive system, right? What we are is human beings that have values that are taking us in a direction of what we hope is a profession that is helping, that is nurturing, that applies its own lessons to itself, that embodies the values that it says that it embodies. And then when we find that's not the case, unfortunately, what I hear and what I experienced as well is, within these systems of oppression, and I love the description that you shared from Bell Hooks there around capitalism, patriarchy, white supremacy culture, and imperialism, but when we enter into these or enter further into these systems that are, as you said, enacting and upholding these relationships of power, what we end up in is a situation where somehow we become inadvertent allies or perpetrators of the same oppression. And then that undermines that. It's almost like, as you said, people then start to question your integrity. And then we start to say to ourselves, well, who are we? And this is where I feel like the disillusionment and loss of trust in ourselves comes, and the dehumanization, which is, well, who am I really if I've been involved in doing those things as well? Has it made me an actor of these systems where, I've been, it's like the nature of these systems can only be so pervasive and so robust because they recruit people into enacting them in ways, if they were conscious, they wouldn't dream of doing.
I mean, I don't know if it's about not dreaming of doing. I mean, I think that kind of consciousness is such a big part of it, but also there can be a sense of, we don't have a choice. We are in these systems that we have to navigate them, and actually, it's like you get really into it. Like, for example, down this track of this career, that actually to step away from it, which I think is what you're doing, Wendy, which is really enabling people and creating a community so that people can step out of the system and create something that's a lot more, like you use the word regenerative, but a lot more meaningful, and also that hopefully doesn't inflict the same level of harm.
Right.
But we have to survive as well. And
Yes.
unfortunately, the way to survive is we have no choice but to navigate these systems. So you're absolutely right.
Absolutely.
I would go as far as saying we are all harmed by these systems, and we are all complicit in them as well.
Yeah. 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 That's a great way
Um,
to kind of summarize it, I think. Christina, just wanted to draw you back into the conversation there from these kind of reflections and what's kind of come up for you as we were kind of reflecting on some of these processes, trying to get a little bit more perspective and distance on them.
Yeah, it would be really interesting to hear what some of your experiences there, Taslim, and I'm really sorry that you've had to go through some of that. What was coming to mind for me was some similar themes, really. Particularly like doctoral training, when we tried to bring some sense of challenge at that point to some of the diagnoses that the DSM that was being used, and psychology seeming to go default to this almost like a psychiatrist mode of seeing that there is scope in diagnosis and really talking about the evidence base for these criteria and any sense of challenge towards that at that point, whilst I was at the time going through my own EMDR therapy. So yeah, I was quite highly emotional and distressed. It was seen, that when I challenged this idea of personality disorders, that actually they would be saying, well, it's a spectrum, Christina, and you're actually on that spectrum. They didn't say it in quite those words, but there was that suggestion there that, well, this is a spectrum and we're all on it. Some of us more so than others. So it was like any sense of trying to challenge the status quo it could be quite quickly thrown back at
Right.
you, being, well, that's about you and your problems, that you need to
Yeah.
sort out in order to qualify. I think that was actually said by one of the supervisors, again, sort of putting an individual problems as opposed to seeing the bigger context and thinking about how we can support individuals. And this sense in the profession as well, I think, of seeing psychologists or as professionals, us as being in some way different from the people that we are helping and supporting.
Yeah.
So in the clinical field of seeing that them and us and that splitting off of then being able to be quite degrading or judgmental towards, as we say, patients, clients, or people that we're working with. And I've always taken that position that we are working with the communities. We are part of that community, and what we see
Yeah.
within the community and the problems, as a participant and also a helper, and it's been able to see ourselves as equals. But like you say, we're at that point where there is the power and the oppressive systems, and we're not necessarily being as collaborative as we could or should be.
Yeah. No. And just to kind of bring this regenerative lens in, the more I learn about it, what I learn is that fundamentally it goes back to this story of separation, which is at the heart of all of Western science and kind of ways of knowing, which is that we are the neutral observers, and we observe the subjects, and then we make observations that are verifiable about these subjects. And this story of separation has pervaded so much of so many of these systems, which is that we're somehow separate from the world around us, separate from these life systems, that we're different from these life systems. We have a special status. Some people have more special statuses than others. And you can see how it kind of starts to, kind of pervade and permeate all of these different things that we're trying to do. And at the end of it, people like ourselves go into professions, and the principle that I come back to, that I think a lot of us kind of think about, is what gives life to this person in front of me? What gives life to this community around me? What gives life to this society and the places where we are, which include, non-human species as well as the humans. At its heart is more of a regenerative perspective, but it's absolutely antithetical. That question, what gives life, is antithetical to capitalism, patriarchy, white supremacy culture, and imperialism, because all of those systems are based on a story of separation. So it's almost like within psychology, we're challenging when we come back to some of these things about how are we parts of the community that we work with? How are we in a session, coaching, therapy, consultation, facilitation, how are we like the people, not separate from the people that we're working with, but how are we like the people that we're working with? How are our stories intertwined? How do we weave communities together? All of these things are, a fundamental challenge to the power bases. And therefore, we either get with the program or we ship out. It seems like that, that's where we get to essentially. So coming back to you, Taslim, what was it that kind of led to you deciding to work in your own way within this kind of independent private practice context?
So can I just go back a step actually?
Yeah.
Because there were just some of the things that you were sharing that just reminded me of a couple of things. So I'd like to quote Bell Hooks again.
Awesome.
So she's my friend Lauren Forsoff shared pieces of writing. She's a brilliant writer. So in Bell Hooks' book, Teaching to Transgress, she shares her own story about her own academic journey, and fundamentally psychology is kind of grounded within academia. And she says the only important aspect of our identity was whether or not our minds function, whether we were able to do our jobs in the classroom. The self was presumably emptied out the moment the threshold was crossed, leaving in place only an objective mind, free of experiences and biases. There was fear that the conditions of that self would interfere with the teaching and or academic process. And that I think that quote just really sums up what you've just been sharing and been talking about. And I will come back to your question, which I might ask you to repeat. But the other thing that kind of came to mind as you were sharing this was that often the parts of psychology that I'm drawn to are actually the ones that borrow wisdom from indigenous and Eastern traditions. And this is also really difficult because there's so much in those approaches which feels regenerative, like using this term, that feels life-giving, that feels connecting, that feels like it's a way of meeting the other as not the other in a way.
Yeah.
That kind of recognizes the we and the us rather than that kind of that separation. And I find that so sad at the same time, because on the one hand, we create a separation between us and them. We've used the word communities, and I know that could mean lots of different communities, but often these types of things impact minority communities a lot more. And yet the wisdom that we draw on from within psychology that actually moves us towards these more hopeful, regenerative aliveness practices come from those very same communities. And that's something that I find really difficult. But I think, so coming back to your question, I think when I started to see and realize this, it was actually a bit of an empowering journey for me, because what I realized is, yes, I am different. And I'm different because of lots of different things. But actually what makes me different is what the people in power desire and yearn for so much. That's
Mm.
why my ancestral wisdom is appropriated. That is why there is a yearning for this, to bring back this psychology of the soul. So I think that in and of itself has enabled me to say, I inherently know within myself, whether or not it's been researched yet or not, that these things fundamentally are about being human, and really make a difference, not only in my own life but to my client's life as well. So there's something in that that's kind of almost in my own psyche, I guess, is readdressing that power dynamic. So almost like I'm kind of, I don't know if that makes sense, kind of taking that power back in a way, that there's something around, yeah, just that. And I think there was a real pivotal moment where this happened for me. So one of the areas that I've specialised in for many years is acceptance and commitment therapy. I've been working with that for 15, coming up to 15 years now. And because of my own colonial history or ancestral history, it's been well over 100 years. It's coming up to 125 years that my family have not lived in India, which is where we originated from. And so we were not taken, but we migrated from India to East Africa, largely as labourers, so to build train tracks and so forth, and then from East Africa to the Western world. And I always speak about my communities as being broken by colonialism and brokers of colonialism. But so with this kind of awareness about what I was saying before, about that our indigenous kind of wisdom is really what these new third wave therapies, etc., are drawing on, even if some of them deny that that's what
Yes.
they're doing. They are.
Yeah.
I became very close to someone called Sakshi Bansal, who I think that you might be aware
Yes.
of. And she shared with me one of her workshops on that she drew from Indian psychology. And I sat there and thinking, well, this is so aligned to the way that ACT or RFT, which is relational frame theory, conceptualizes the self. And this is also part of my own belief systems from my own kind of understanding. And I think that recognition was both so painful, but also so hopeful. And it was painful because I am learning about my own ancestral wisdom through a Western lens, because that's what's accessible to me. And that feels deeply painful. And through connecting to these amazing people who have grown up in the country that I'm from, that I've not grown up in, I now have access to our ancestral wisdom from coming from within my own culture. And so that feels really beautiful. So I would say, I can't remember what the question was, but I think one of the things that's really supporting me in kind of coming out of this disillusionment and starting to think about how I can bring some of this into my practice is through connecting with people who have a direct connection to that ancestral wisdom. And Sakshi is one of those people that we've kind of got a mini study group going on with us. We're kind of learning about this Indian psychology, as well as just knowing, just having this kind of deep knowing and trust that this is what's needed, and people are really yearning for it. Again, I've gone on for ages, sorry.
No, don't apologize, not at all.
I know it's a podcast, and that's what we're meant to be doing.
We're here, right?
Just like, I can go it really good for one.
And as you're describing that, it made me think about, and I'm going to come to Christina in a second, but just to try and also provide a segue in this sense, because one of the writers and psychologists I've been quite influenced by recently has been Sharon Blackie. Now, Sharon Blackie went and studied myths and legends of Western Europe. So we think about what had to be exiled first before capitalism, patriarchy, white supremacy culture, imperialism could flourish. And what it was also our original culture, which was animist, which was shamanistic, which was rooted in interbeing with the environment in which we grew up. And what we only have left now, we don't have direct, because this we're talking about 1500 years, right, of lost connection. But what we have are the myths and legends and the stories. And so, Sharon Blackie has been very much kind of bringing that back into, with books like Haggitude and The Enchanted Life and so on, about what that might look like for us in this world. And that's my link to Christina, because I know, Christina, you also then went into your own path of study of integrating more kind of holistic, spiritual, and then even, basing yourself in Cornwall, which is a very kind of spiritual place to be in the British Isles as well.
Yeah, I was really interested in those discussions that were unfolding then, because my journey, I suppose, to rebuilding trust and overcoming the disillusionment has been my own healing through, the yoga trainings, very sort of influenced by Indian culture and psychology in the yogic philosophies and practices. And the shamanic initiations. I mean, that has been ongoing for me since maybe 2017. I started sort of exploring those alternative modalities, but going right back to the root of what what it is to be human and how to heal. Because for me, what was missing within the mainstream psychology, which it still is really. The mindfulness was great, yeah, but it was lacking spirit. They'd completely cut the spiritual connection out, and it was devoid of, as the services are as well, of the heart and the soul. And thinking back to sort of where have we lost that, like you say, in terms of our ancestry, but also thinking about the murdering of women in particular, in terms of the witch trials, and anyone with any sort of gifts or
That's true.
was killed. So there's still this sort of sense of talking about or stepping into these alternative ways of healing or being, where we do rely on I said in my clinical psychology interview, I talked a lot about intuition, because I've always sort of, that knowing, that deep knowing and understanding of other people, or, what people might need, or what the right next steps are. That is intuitive. And actually, in the psychology field and training, a lot of it's like imposed ideas, models, what so-and-so said back at what date, and following these principles and practices. On the ground with an individual who's in front of you, or a community it doesn't apply to, like Taslim said, who aren't white, who aren't male, aren't ethnocentric, they're not applying. There's a disconnect, trying to impose a model or approach onto a person or a community. But when we go back to some of these indigenous practices that really do connect us to more, the energetics, and thinking more, instead of the mind, the cognitive, the academic, literary focus, coming back to the felt sense, connecting with the body, connecting with the heart, and I suppose it's from there that we become, I say, equal, in a as equal as we can be, and trying to remove or overcome some of the power differentials, and start from the root up to try and be more humane and understanding of one another, as opposed to the current psychological way of being at times, which isn't
Yeah.
as centered and connected. Although I know ACT, like you say, the third wave therapists are becoming more informed by what we once would have known and been. I'm not sure if that's answering the question. But
Well, the thing is, what it strikes me about as well is how actually there are sometimes tacit recognition. There is tacit recognition of some of these fault lines in the ways of practicing in something like psychology. I mean, it's probably in other areas of science, but here we are talking about psychology. Um, I count myself as being quite fortunate of doing an applied psychology master's degree. And if I'd have known that it was so stats based, my master's degree, I probably wouldn't have done it because I didn't believe in myself as being someone capable of doing advanced statistics. But what I was fortunate enough to experience in my master's was, yes, studying the statistics and what kind of went into and what those quantitative methods were actually doing and how they were trying to quantify variance between different populations and what the maths of that was, and the underlying mathematical models. And then within that, there was an understanding, quite an explicit understanding, that that was about creating a map of reality, but it wasn't the territory. That there was always going to be, because we, looked at research design, there was always going to be unexplained variants out there, the likes of which we could probably never capture. So that immediately reduced the power of the quantitative, because we knew quantitative could help us in some ways, but there's a whole world of variance out there that is unexplained and probably unexplainable, but it's still, in inverted commas, reality. So, what you were describing, Christina, about intuition, the fact that we can't quantify it and put a p value on it or whatever, some people, or I'm saying some people, that you can get into arguments easily about the p value of something. But I think, and what I think gets prioritized is, this empiricism about, have we been able to put this through a randomized control test? But there's the whole, an entire kind of beauty of qualitative research, and even that is a small subset of all the other ways of knowing that there are in the world, which is phenomenology, right? So even phenomenology is kind of putting it in a particular lens. But um, I, I think for me, that was where I think what that's helped me do as well. Coming back to what became a way of having one's feet on solid ground whilst we're navigating these systems that are, throwing us all over the place. Taz, you're talking about reconnecting with ancestral wisdom and bringing that up to date, bringing that from there into the here and now and feeling that thread of connection. And Christina, similarly, feeling like all this stuff that was just such a maelstrom, actually, there's a whole story here of repressed knowledge about people, stories of genocide essentially within our own culture, where healers and wise people and intuitives were got rid of in recent history, last few hundred years, really. And so, it's, for me, it's that sense of, where do we put our feet on solid ground again after we'd been swimming for so long and feeling as though we're going to drown in something, and like we get our feet back on solid ground, and now we have a different relationship with all of that power stuff. So yeah, those are some of my reflections. I don't know what comes up for either of you at that point.
There's something else here that I think again is something that you've really facilitated, Wendy, which is about community. That and what you said right at the beginning of the podcast, which is around co-regulation, and that actually over the last few years, the more that I have found ways to speak some of my experiences, the more that I have found other people who are probably, I perceive them as having more power than me because of their particular identities and so forth, but who are who are challenging the status quo, who are being more radical in their approaches, and actually those opportunities for connecting with those people kind of gives, for me, it feeds that. That's part of that journey for me about rebuilding trust in myself.
Yes.
That I'm still not always able to do that myself, because I guess that trust has been eroded relationally. So I feel like that trust needs to be built back up again relationally.
Yeah.
And so actually seeing more and more people challenging some of these things is really helping me, I think, continue to step forward and continue to heal and grow out of those career traumas. So I don't know why that arose for me as you were speaking, but it did.
Yeah, no, but I think that as I think about that idea of putting our feet back on solid ground, that to me is about something about rebuilding trust. And I think your point about the very individualistic way of thinking about that is that we start by rebuilding trust in ourselves and then rebuild trust in others. But I think what you're saying is actually I can start by rebuilding trust in others, and then in that way I start to rebuild trust in myself as well. That's an interbeing lens on trust.
Yeah, and I think that comes back to, this is the part of psychology that I do really love, is about why human babies are born so completely dependent on adults. It is, I never believe that things are one way. So, the sense of I need to, people say, oh, you need to love yourself before anyone else can love you or whatever, all this thing. And I always think it's like an ebb and flow, like, as in the more I trust myself, the more I'm able to trust others. The more I trust others, the more I'm able to trust myself. Like it's a constant kind of back and forth flow, I think. And also the sense of like other people believing in me helps me believe more in myself. Yeah. And therefore I'm able to believe more in others, and again vice versa. So it just kind of grows, I think, organically.
It's a relationship of reciprocity. It's reciprocal.
Exactly.
In that sense.
Yeah.
Christina, for you, what has helped in terms of rebuilding trust in self and others when we think about that reciprocity as well?
I think it's still an ongoing journey and it fluctuates. Certainly in terms of connecting with like-minded people, or people who've had similar experiences. Taslim, you sharing some of your experiences again, you sort of that feeling that we're not alone in this sort of journey of experiencing difficulties and challenges along the way. And like you say, sort of having some, I think particularly for me, because I am, I don't know what it is yet, but was writing. And I found that because journaling does help in terms of, processing whatever's in the subconscious. But some of the things I thought that I was going to be publishing, the work of like Dr. Jessica Taylor, The Sexy But Psycho, the book, when that came out, part of me was like, well, that's the book I'm supposed to be writing.
Hang on.
For my own healing process, it was like, I think actually, thank fuck, someone else has written it. Thank God she's taken like, she's running ahead with the baton, and she's really taken this sort of field head on with, power and courage. And that's actually helped in my healing journey, because
Yeah.
I know that the things she's fighting for, would help me as an individual, would help all other women and girls that come into sort of contact with mental health services, and knowing that you're not alone in that sort of battle, really, because that can feel overwhelming, to think that you're the only one that has a certain viewpoint, or is challenging the status quo, when there's other people out there that are doing it and are doing a bloody good job of it. It gives you a resource, really, to follow in their footsteps or connect and support their work also. So I'm a member of, get the wording right, AV. I need to check my. I'm a member of the anti-pathologizing sort of network professionals. All the links will be on the show notes, I believe. But that's sort of headed up by Jessica Taylor, in terms of practitioners, professionals who you can go to for support, who don't hold sort of the DSM and the diagnostic and pathologizing sort of framework as. We don't hold that to be true, basically. And we see everything through that lens of trauma. Everything is a response to trauma, as opposed to a disorder or a disability, a disorder or an illness. So, having people that out there that are singing from the same hymn sheet, I think that enables you to build trust in a way of doing things differently as you go forwards. So that's been central for me, to see other professionals out there with those similar viewpoints.
Yeah. And I think that's why I really wanted to have a conversation about this topic, with you two, knowing a little bit also about some of the history from both of you, that it was going to be, we were going to get into some depths of what we're doing about that. The question that I come back to is, thinking about, where do we go from here, really, as a practitioner? I know I'm building things into my way of practicing that give me hope that there is a place for me to go and a place for other people to go when they're, redefining what it means to be in practice as a psychologist, whether you're doing that independently or whether you're doing that within some of the big, organizations or whatever that are out there. Just thinking about kind of drawing our conversation to a close here. What else do you think we need to know and consider when we're thinking about overcoming career trauma, which is a very sanitized label for what we're describing here, and this kind of disillusionment and rebuilding trust? What else should practitioners know about, consider, think about, perhaps? I'm going to come to you. Can I come to you, Christina, first?
Sorry.
It's all right.
I've gone blank.
So question was, what else do practitioners need to think about or consider for thinking about, a message of hope to people about overcoming this very sanitized thing that we call career trauma and this disillusionment and kind of rebuilding trust? What message of hope would we offer to people? Or would you offer to people?
I think, which would have helped me maybe earlier in my career, but that sense of knowing that you're not alone, that I think when we are working in, maybe sanitized services and settings, and people are maybe not putting their head above the parapet and, just going along with things, we can feel very isolated, and that maybe it is me that's just not getting on with it. Maybe I am being difficult, coming back to that trust in self, I suppose, going back from the head into the heart, and knowing, if things don't feel right, whether it's in interactions with a colleague, whether it's the setting in itself, that coming back to what your intuition and what you know to be true, and seeking the support, as opposed to being silenced and siloed and separate and isolated. There is always someone somewhere in some service that will provide a listening ear at least. But I think if we are feeling traumatized as well, there can be that tendency to disconnect, dissociate, isolate, and be alone. So I think I've been in that position for a long time, actually. So taking those steps forward sooner rather than later to reconnect. It is like about relationships. That we can then move forward and regain that trust when we've been burnt.
Fab. Thank you. Taz, I'm coming across to you.
Yeah, so really similar things to Christina. I mean, I think firstly, the first thing is that it does take time. That even with me working through a lot of trauma on a lot of different levels, both personal and professional, I mean, in some ways it feels like a lifetime's journey in a way. And that there are going to be, for me anyway, moments when things can be kind of triggered and I'm kind of right back there again. But I would say that for me, that recovery journey gets quicker and quicker every time. And I think there's something around learning from those past experiences so that we do feel able to make different choices going forward. So coming back to, for example, that sense of like always needing approval, or kind of like waiting for somebody else to say, no, you're doing a good job. And also that kind of, I don't know if I can put words to it, but can I give an example? I know we're kind of wrapping up, but so I had an interview last year that was so fascinating. So it was for workshop facilitation, and it wasn't, I asked for reasonable adjustments. They weren't particularly effectively offered for that interview process. And the interview process was just awful, and it didn't allow me to show the best of myself. And it was for associate training work. And it was bizarre so they rejected me despite the fact that their SLT I've got recommendations and testimonials from them saying I am one of the best facilitators they've ever experienced. And yet I was still rejected from that company. Versus another organisation, I just had an interview for some associate work yesterday, where the whole setup of the interview enabled me to show them who I am and the best of myself. And so that experience last year took me right back to that place of, oh God, I'm awful, blah, blah, blah. And this experience was a very different experience. But I think what I'm now learning to do is saying, but if that is what that organisation is like, that is not an organisation that I want to work with. And so there's something about kind of bringing, like me recognising my own agency and my own choice. And kind of within that, I don't know if that was very rambly, but so I think there's something around, this is a journey. It does take time. We may find ourselves back in those places, and with support we can continue to remind ourselves of our own worth, and really trust our intuition, as Christina said as well. And then I guess the other thing is about just being for me, there's something about being really honest with myself. So learning how to tell the truth about my experiences to myself and others. I think that's another thing. And also, I don't think we can do this alone. I really think that this healing journey after experiencing career traumas and disillusionment is about doing it together. And that comes back to what you were saying, Christina, about the sense that we're not alone. And then somehow, I don't know how, but it's like somehow finding the courage to do things slightly differently. And I am going to refer to my logo that you can see in the background. So this is half of
Oh,
it. This isn't the
yes.
whole thing.
I was glad you
But
were going to mention that then.
yeah, um, but you know, like so when I first was working with my website designer to come up with this logo, I was like, it doesn't feel professional. Like it's fun and a bit quirky and creative and really colourful. But I was like, but that is me. Like that's what I want to offer. I want to offer something different. I don't want it to be standard corporate looking. I am warm, I am colourful. It's like a mehndi type of or henna type of design, so that kind of links to my cultural background. And it's got lots of different elements that are all unique, kind of coming together to make something beautiful. So there's so much in it that relates to thriving together, which, as you know, is my brand. And I think there's something about in my practice, how do I find ways of coming back into alignment? How do I find ways of being honest with myself and others about the way I am, how I practice, even if that is slightly different from the norm or what's expected? Yeah, so I think that's sure there's
Awesome.
lots of other things, but those are the things that come to mind.
Yeah. And just kind of drawing three like threads together there. The thing that really kind of stands out for me, or almost like the message that kind of came from inside inside me somewhere, was, if I'm thinking of a message of hope, I've got a little bit of a kind of, warrior part of me that's like, do you know what? Psychology belongs to all of us. It doesn't belong to some deity somewhere, some god on high to be passed down like the flipping tablets on the mount or whatever. That's not what psychology is. Psychology belongs to all of us. And so if we're saying that this is not a representation, this is missing vital parts, actually all of us have the right to stand on our 2 feet and make that statement. So there's something for me when I think about what's required to be for psychology to be more life-giving. It's also has to be more democratized. We have to be closer to people. We have to be connected with one another. We need to have more democratized power relationships. We can't just be about bowing to the power of institutions or bowing to the power of norms or whatever. Um, so yeah, that's kind of the message of hope. And there's a lot of us who are thinking like this, and there's a growing number of us who are thinking like this. So come and join us. It's cool in this part of the world, right? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. If we want change, then I suppose it's taking that empowered action, isn't it? And then trusting in ourselves and our beliefs, really, and
Yeah.
following that path.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Can I share
Thank
a
you.
quote
Yeah, go on.
before we
Yeah, I love
end?
your quotes, Taz.
This so this is by Orion Mountain Dreamer, and it sums up, I think, how I want to be and hope I am in my practice, especially in my coaching practice. But so it says, what if becoming who and what we truly are happens not through trying and striving, but by welcoming the people, places, and practices who offer us the warmth of encouragement we need to unfold.
There we go.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Thanks so much, both of you, for being here today. It's been such a rich and going back on bringing back thinking about my IFS training. It's been a very self-led and energizing conversation. So, and a very courageous conversation as well. Thanks to both of you for that. Dr. Christina Barker is a clinical and holistic psychologist, trauma specialist, EMDR and somatic therapist based in Cornwall, UK. She takes an integrative, holistic approach to mental health, incorporating mind, body, and spirit. She offers private therapeutic retreats focused on trauma healing through connection of body, breath, and nature. You can find Christina on LinkedIn at Dr. Christina Barker, on Instagram at Dr. Christina Barker, and on the website at drchristinabarker.com. Taslim Tharani, an organizational and coaching psychologist and founder of Thriving Together, is dedicated to fostering equity and belonging. She supports individuals to embrace their identities and thrive through transformative coaching and inclusive leadership. You can find her on LinkedIn at Taslim Tharani. That's TASLIM THARANI. Taslim Tharani. Have you experienced a toxic workplace or felt drained, disillusioned, or isolated in your practice? Perhaps it's time to transform your professional journey. Our Practice Accelerator and coaching programs are crafted to help you create a thriving practice aligned with your well-being and values. If you're curious about what this could look like for you, visit our website and explore how we can support you in building a fulfilling and sustainable practice. You don't have to navigate this alone. Let's thrive together. Join us at inspiringpsych.com. That's inspiringpsych.com.